Hi everyone, this is Morgan, and in this video I'm going to talk through the setup for your final painting for the fruit and color project. I'm beginning that process by looking at the 6 paintings I've done so far. For you, it's likely that 5 of those will be digital pieces and 1 will be a physical piece. So I'd pick at this point which color relationships I think were the most successful and think about which version of this piece I would like to see reflected 3 times. At this point, it would be good to consider where my paint supply is at. So obviously, as you choose which color relationship to explore, keep in mind your final piece will be 14 inches by 14 inches, and you should make sure you have enough paint to cover 14 by 14 inches. Another good thing to do early on is to flatten your paper, especially if it's been rolled up since you left campus. You'll see that I'm using art books to try to flatten it down. It may be best to leave it with heavy things over it for about a day before even trying to cut out a piece. If you only were able to leave campus with 1 sheet of watercolor paper, I would recommend cutting out a 15-inch square piece. If you were able to grab 2, you can afford to cut out at least 16 by 16 inch or a 16 by 16 inch piece. The reason you may want to cut out a bigger piece if you're able to is just so you can have a broader margin. If you cut out a 15 by 15 inch piece, you only get a 1/2 inch border all the way around your piece, which is manageable, but it might be a little bit easier to work with it if you have that extra 1/2 inch all the way around. Again, that's only an option if you were able to grab 2 sheets of watercolor paper before leaving campus. So once you've gotten the piece cut out, I would leave the paper under something heavy if it needs more time to fully flatten out. You can also take this time to tape your borders. So use drafting tape to create a 14 by 14 inch square, and maybe even consider taping down the paper onto a table or other flat surface with drafting tape. Since your paper is just sort of ready to go, assuming that you've checked and your paint supply is where you want it to be, the next thing to consider is which of your 6 paintings you're going to choose to reflect, which color scheme you thought worked the best, and also how you're going to reflect. That might seem like an odd question, but when you choose to reflect, you have 4 possible centers. I'm going to illustrate using Photoshop what I mean by this to make it a little bit less abstract. It's a choice you could definitely make physically as well. This just gives you a pre-visualization of what that stage looks like. Here I'm showing you the final 4 possible reflection options, each that has a different corner of my piece as the center. I think this might be helpful for some of you as you try to pick out how you want to tackle the actual final piece. So I've opened just my Journal 4 split complementary piece in Photoshop, and I'm going to show you how I made all of these different variations. You'll see I'm starting off with my Photoshop document, which is large. You'll see it's 12 just without layers, but it's more like 80 with all these layers. So I'll begin just by going layer, flatten image, just so I don't, clog up Photoshop with a bigger file than I actually need. And now it's down to being a better size all around. I'm going to unlock my background layer just to make a few future stages easier. And I'm going to image canvas size. I want to change the actual size of my canvas. It's starting out as a 7 by 7 piece. I know I eventually want to have a 14 by 14 inch painting, so I'll enter that in. I also want to set the anchor point to the top left corner so that my existing piece is just hanging out in the top left. We'll play around with having that large strawberry as the centerpiece first. So that's where I'm starting off. I just pressed Command J to duplicate the layer. That's something we've done before, but Command J is the shortcut to make a duplicate layer. And I just dragged it over to be in the top right corner. Obviously, reflection hasn't happened yet. I've just copied. To reflect this piece, I'm going to go to the Edit dropdown, Transform, and select Flip Vertical. So when this happens, my piece has literally been flipped horizontally. So now I've reflected it one time. I have a nice mirror image. I'm going to simplify the next stage. I press Shift to select both of my layers in the layers panel and then hit Command J. So now you'll see I've made duplicates of both my existing layers, and I can go Edit, Transform, and this time I'm going to flip vertically. Again, I want that big strawberry to be in the center. So this is one possible way that I could practice reflection and create my final painting. I could have that large strawberry as the centerpiece. I want to save this as an option. It helps me, again, I like pre-visualization to be able to study all of my options. So I'm saving this as reflection 1. And just to save space, I'm going to save this as a JPEG, which I'd encourage you to do for all of them. So that's one possible variation. Now I get to pick which new centerpiece I want. Next, I'm going to go for having that kind of, I don't know, like what's on the outer middle edges together. So I'm dragging the layers around so that my right side images and left side images are next to each other. So now I'm selecting 2 layers by holding on to Shift, and I'm dragging what were the right side layers to the left, and now I'll drag, again using Shift, what were the left side layers over to the right. So now I have a totally different centerpiece that also practices reflection. And again, I'm just saving another reflection option so that I can study them easily later on. You'll see for this one, I forgot to save it as a JPEG, which I'll go back and correct later on. But now I at least have that option. So I've done 2 possible reflections. Now I'm going to move on to having what are kind of the middle outside. That's a weird way of putting it. Some of the smaller strawberries are now going to be the centerpiece. So I'm moving what were the top layers in this second variation down to the bottom, and the bottom 2 layers up. So that's our third possible way of practicing reflection with this piece. I'm going to go Save As, and this will now be reflection 3. And this time I do remember to save it as a JPEG. So the final one are, I just need to flip my left and right sides to have what are on these outside right and left edges as the centerpiece. So again, I'm just scooting the layers around so that I can move the right layers together to the left and the left layers together to the right. So this is our 4th and final reflection possibility. So I'll save this. And again, I'm just saving them so I have options, but it's nice to do. And I've got it. So here is where we can look back at these options and study them and choose which version of reflection we want to use with our final painting. I want to stress that we're no longer really concerned about having a clear foreground, middle ground, and background. We're going to lose any real sense of illusionary space just because we're kind of looking at like a kaleidoscope version of our initial piece anyway. It's really just which one you think is the strongest composition. I really expected that the top left one would be my favorite. I'm kind of favoring the top right one just because I like sort of the vortex feel of that piece. But there's not a bad option up here. It's just personal preference. At this point, whenever you choose which corner is going to be your centerpiece, you're choosing how you're going to execute your lead transfer, because like with Journal 4 Part 1, you're going to do a lead transfer onto watercolor paper to create the outlines that you will then use to make the final painting. That process will be covered in a future video. This is really just walked you through setup and planning. So please shoot any questions about this my way. I really do zoom through the Photoshop aspect of this pre-visualization. Again, that is just an optional stage, but let me know if you have questions. Thanks, everyone.